Hello, everyone. Welcome back to those of you who sat in on my session on public service loan forgiveness. We're now going to talk about the other half of the public service loan forgiveness puzzle, or a whole other program that's totally unrelated to public service loan forgiveness if you're not pursuing it: income-driven repayment plans. Income-driven repayment plans are those which generally set a borrower's payment amount based on a borrower's income and family size, and which, depending on a borrower's circumstances, may offer loan forgiveness to the borrower if their loans are not repaid in full by the end of 20 or 25 years. I like to open my sessions about income-driven repayment by talking about how the share of loan balances which are being repaid by income-driven repayment have increased significantly over time, and it may help provide some context for some of what you heard this morning in the federal update and the opening remarks by the Secretary and Mr. Manning. Starting in 2013, which is I think when we started publishing data about this, income-driven repayment represented only about 20% of the outstanding loan balance that was being repaid. Today, about 5 years later, it's over 50%. So in 5 years, the share of direct loans that are being repaid under income-driven repayment based on outstanding loan balance has more than doubled. And that has a lot of implications for how our loan portfolio is being repaid. But before we get into any of that, or how income-driven repayment may work for an individual borrower, I'm going to talk you through the various myriad of rules that apply to borrowers that are seeking to repay their loans under an income-driven plan. There are 4 of them: the Income-Contingent Repayment Plan, which was created in 1994, the Income-Based Repayment Plan, which was created in 2009, the Pay-As-You-Earn Repayment Plan, which was created in 2012, and the Revised Pay-As-You-Earn Plan, which was created in 2015. We're going to start by talking about which borrowers are eligible for which plans. There are a host of eligibility criteria that borrowers need to meet depending on what type of loans they have, the loan program they borrowed from, etc. But this slide provides a high-level overview of the requirements. All 4 of the income-driven repayment plans require that you have what we call an eligible loan to repay your loan under each of the plans. And the rules, perhaps not unsurprisingly, all have different rules or definitions about what loans are eligible. So we'll get into that in the next few slides. The income-based and pay-as-you-earn repayment plans, to enter the plan, require what is described on this slide we call show need. This isn't show need in the EFC sense of the term. It's a more general term where roughly we look to see whether or not your payment would decrease if you entered this plan relative to the 10-year standard repayment plan, which tends to offer the highest monthly payments out of any plan. So it's a pretty generous comparison where, say, your 10-year standard repayment plan is $100 a month. If your IBR payment would have been $50 a month, then you have need for IBR, and you can enter it. But if your 10-year standard plan was $100 a month and your IBR payment would have been $150 a month, you don't really need IBR to lower your payments, and so you're not eligible. At least for pay-as-you-earn, you're also required to be what, again, on this slide is summarily captured as being a recent borrower, which we define as a new borrower on or after October 1, 2007, who received a disbursement of a loan on or after October 1, 2011. That is an incredibly complicated series of dates and principles to understand. I don't expect any of you to understand it, and frankly, I don't even think we expect most borrowers to understand it either. But we'll talk later about how we mitigate some of that lack of understanding through the application process. Moving on to eligible loan programs. As you know, we have direct loans, federal family education loans, or FELP, and federal Perkins loans. Direct loans are eligible for all 4 of the income-driven repayment plans, whereas FELP loans are only eligible for one of the 4 income-driven repayment plans, income-based repayment plan, and federal Perkins loans on their own are eligible for none of the income-driven repayment plans. Perkins loans only have the 10-year standard repayment plan available to them, which isn't to say that borrowers with Perkins loans or FELP program loans can expand their access to income-driven repayment plans so that they can get access to all 4 of them. They can. That's through a process called loan consolidation, where you effectively convert your loans into one new loan through the direct loan program, which theoretically becomes eligible for all 4 of the income-driven plans. Within each loan program, as you know, there are various loan types. In the direct loan program, you have sub and unsub, grad plus, parent plus, and consolidation loans. On this slide, those are the loan types we're talking about. The only thing that you should really take away from this slide is that if you received a loan as a student, so we're talking about sub or unsub, or a graduate plus loan, then you're eligible for all 4 of the income-driven repayment plans if they're from the right loan program. Loans that you received as a parent, i.e. parent plus loans, are not eligible for any of the income-driven repayment plans. Where things get a little bit more interesting, however, is when we're talking about loan consolidation. If you consolidate only loans that you received as a student, so if you only consolidate grad plus, sub, unsub into a consolidation loan, that loan is eligible for all 4 of the income-driven repayment plans, just like they would have been had you never consolidated. But if you consolidate loans that include even one parent plus loan, even if you had a whole other mix of loans that you received as a student, like a grad plus loan or an unsub loan, that new consolidation loan is only eligible for the income-contingent repayment plan. So borrowers who are parent borrowers and student borrowers in their own right, who are trying to maximize their benefit for income-driven repayment, have to go through a variety of steps to ensure that they're only consolidating the right loans at the right time so that they don't disqualify themselves for income-driven plans that they might have otherwise qualified for. Now that we know who's eligible for these plans, let's talk about what they owe when they are eligible on a monthly basis. Most of the income-driven repayment plans set payment amounts using 2 different formulas, and where there are 2 different formulas, borrowers will always pay the lesser of the 2. Let's start with the ICR plan, income contingent repayment. Payments are the lesser of 20% of discretionary income, or a payment that's based on the 12-year standard repayment plan that is then adjusted based on income. Now, something to bear in mind about this 12-year standard repayment plan is that it's not even a plan that we actually offer. You can't say, I want a 12-year standard repayment plan and then get that. This is just the way that the formula works, where we figured out what you would have paid over the course of 12 years with a fixed payment in order to figure out what your ICR payment is. Income-based repayment sets payments at the lesser of 15% of discretionary income or the 10-year standard repayment amount. Again, this is whichever is less. So you'll see this in some slides later, but there's sort of this inflection point for borrowers in IBR and pay-as-you-earn in particular, where the payment will sort of gradually rise and then eventually plateau. This is where payment converts from one based on income to one based on loan debt. And ultimately, the payment that's based on loan debt is ultimately can be considered a protection for borrowers, so that even if their income rises such that their payment would have been higher than the 10-year standard plan, payments instead are capped at that amount. The same ultimate structure is true for pay-as-you-earn, except payments are generally 10% of discretionary income instead of 15%. And then the revised pay-as-you-earn takes the 10% payment amount of discretionary income from pay-as-you-earn, but eliminates that secondary formula that caps payments based on loan debt. So again, when we look at a graph later, revised pay-as-you-earn is just going to go like this, and it's never going to plateau. If none of this makes any sense to you, just remember that generally in descending order is the most beneficial plan for most people. So revised pay-as-you-earn is generally the most advantageous plan for most people. Not all people, but most people, followed by pay-as-you-earn, IBR, and ICR, which is generally, and again, generally, rule of thumb here, least advantageous for most people. Income-driven repayment plans also provide interest subsidy benefits, at least some of them do. ICR does not provide an interest subsidy at all, so just ignore that. For the rest of the income-driven plans, subsidy fundamentally works in the same way, where for periods of time, if your loan payment doesn't cover all of the interest that's accruing, some or all of the remainder is paid for by the government. So for example, if your payment is $50 a month, but $100 of interest accrues on your loans every month, there's $50 of interest hanging out there, and some or all of that interest may be subsidized, paid, written off, what have you, by the government. For IBR and pay-as-you-earn, the subsidy works in exactly the same way. It's only for subsidized loans, obviously, because we're talking about a subsidy, and I'll tell you why that was funny in a few minutes. and it's only for the first 3 years. So if during the first 3 years your payment isn't enough to cover all outstanding interest, the government picks up the remainder. For revised pay-as-you-earn on subsidized loans, the subsidy works the same way for the first 3 years. Thereafter, however, instead of subsidizing all of the difference between the interest that accrues in your payment, the government only subsidizes half of it. So again, to take you back to my example, a payment of $50, interest accrues in the amount of $100. There's $50 left that your payment doesn't cover. 50% of that, or $25, is subsidized by the government, and you remain responsible for the remaining $25. And for unsubsidized loans in the revised pay-as-you-earn plan, we also provide an interest subsidy, which generally means that we should start rethinking the names of these loan types. The subsidy for unsubsidized loans and REPAYE extends that same 50% subsidy rate that exists for subsidized loans after the first 3 years for revised pay-as-you-earn for the entire period of repayment on unsubsidized loans. Which, because especially for graduate plus loans can virtually be borrowed in limitless amounts, ultimately can result in some pretty hefty subsidy amounts that reduce the amount of interest that borrowers have to pay. Interest capitalization, if you're doing everything right when it comes to income-driven repayment plans, shouldn't really matter. If you just want to get into an income-driven repayment plan and stay there forever and never fail to recertify your income, which we'll talk about later, then you're not really going to see interest capitalization very much. For IBR, pay-as-you-earn, and revised pay-as-you-earn, if you fail to recertify your income every year, that is a point at which interest capitalizes. For those 3 plans as well, if you ever leave the repayment plan, that is another trigger point for interest capitalization, regardless of whether or not you're leaving one income-driven repayment plan for another. There's technically, at least for IBR and pay-as-you-earn, another inflection point at which interest is capitalized. You'll remember, especially if you're visual, when I was drawing with my hands and the payment was going up for a while and then plateaued and became capped, where the payment transitions from one based on income to one based on loan debt. There is an interest capitalization point right there as well for borrowers who are transitioning between the 2 formulas for IBR and pay-as-you-earn. Depending on how rapidly income has risen, there may or may not actually be any interest outstanding to capitalize, but if there is any outstanding at that point, we will capitalize it. As I mentioned, income-driven repayment plans provide loan forgiveness in their own right. It is only provided to those who have an outstanding balance after the 20 or 25 years of qualifying payment have elapsed. This slide demonstrates which plans hold borrowers to its time frame. ICR, IBR, and the revised pay-as-you-earn plan for any borrower who has any graduate level debt. It is 25 years of qualifying repayment required until a borrower could receive loan forgiveness. For pay-as-you-earn and revised pay-as-you-earn, where the borrower is only repaying loans that he or she received as an undergraduate student, that time period is 20 years. Huge asterisk on loan forgiveness, though, at least under current law. Amounts forgiven due to income-driven repayment are considered income by the IRS, which means that people need to claim it as income on their tax return and may need to pay tax on it. There are, of course, exceptions to whether or not you're required to claim this or not as income. I'm certainly not a tax advisor, so I'm not going to stand up here and talk about what those exceptions are, because frankly, I don't really know anything about them except that they exist. But the general rule is that these are income and people need to pay income tax on them. So now that I've thrown a bunch of detail at you, I am hopefully going to reinforce a lot of that detail, but also demonstrate how the requirements of each of these plans play out for the ever-alliterative Billy borrower. Billy borrower is single with no dependents and lives in Washington, D.C., because I live in Washington, D.C. He has $65,000 of direct loans, $23,000 of which is subsidized, and he has a weighted average interest rate of 5.5%. He borrowed to get for graduate school to get a master's in social work. So he borrowed loans for graduate school, and it means that he'll have to, for revised pay-as-you-earn, repay for 25 years in order to get loan forgiveness. And he has a starting adjusted gross income of $40,000 that rises at 5% a year. If that seems unreasonable to you, I'm inclined to agree. I don't get a 5% raise every year, but some tools that I'll talk about later that allow people to model their own sort of Billy borrower experience do at least make that assumption. And so to provide parity between what you see today and what you might see when you go home, 5% it is. We're starting here with the Income-Contingent Repayment Plan, where payments start at around $450, $464, and gradually increase over the course of 15 years to be $625. So that's less than a rise in $200 per month over the course of 15 years. What you should be able to take away from this slide is that Billy is always paying down principal on his loan, which means that his payment is at least enough to cover the amount of interest that accrues on his loans, which means that his loans never do what we call negatively amortize. Negative amortization occurs when more interest is accruing than the borrower pays down every month due to his or her payment. And when that occurs, it is far more likely that principal, it will take longer for principal to be repaid, because no payment on a student loan can satisfy principal until all outstanding interest has been satisfied. So if that interest hangs out there, it just takes longer until Billy can chip away at loan principal, which ultimately either increases the cost of the loan over time to Billy, or, depending on his circumstances, makes it more likely that he will have an outstanding balance left to be forgiven after the end of 20 or 25 years. So the fact that Billy pays his loan off in year 15 is in some ways attributable to the fact that his loan never negatively amortized. And that's at least in part due to the fact that his payment starts out so high relative to what it would have been under other income-driven repayment plans, Speaking of other income-driven repayment plans, let's take a look at the income-based repayment plan. For those of you who, again, are visual, you see a graph where things generally are increasing rather gradually and then sort of plateau rather quickly and stay there for the remainder of repayment. Unlike ICR, which had Billy's payment starting at $464 a month, his IBR payment starts at $272 a month. Again, that's significantly less than it would have been under ICR. And at least for Billy, it's showing that my rule of thumb about IBR being better than ICR for most borrowers is true for him. What you should also be able to take away from this slide is that Billy's loans do negatively amortize for the first 4 years. It's not until year 5 that Billy starts chipping away at loan principal at all. So between the lower payment, which makes negative amortization more likely, and the fact that his loans did in fact negatively amortize for several years, Billy is in repayment for longer than he was under ICR. For ICR, it was 15 years. For IBR, it's 20 years. So again, there's no loan forgiveness for Billy because he pays his loans off before the end of 25 years. But he will pay significantly more over time as a result. The higher your payment today, the less you pay in interest tomorrow is sort of the turn of phrase that I like to use. And that's true in income-driven repayment as well, as long as you don't get loan forgiveness to basically prevent you from realizing the consequences of the increased interest accrual. So again, take a look at year 16. In year 16, Billy's payment becomes $711 per month, which is the amount that Billy would have paid under the 10-year standard repayment plan based on what he owed when he entered IBR. That is the point at which his payment goes from one based on income to one based on loan debt. If that didn't exist, if that second formula didn't exist, Billy's payment would have been higher than $711 per month, because that $711 payment only kicks in when 15% of his discretionary income is higher than what he would have paid under the 10-year standard plan. So this actually keeps Billy's payment lower, even though it also is going to increase the cost of his loan or increase the likelihood of him getting forgiveness relative to other plans that don't have this secondary payment structure. Pay-as-you-earn looks a lot different from IBR. First of all, payments start out even lower at $182 instead of $272. So that's about a $100 a month difference. Take a look at this again. Here's IBR. The red portion of the graph represents the amount of Billy's payment that's going to loan principal, and the blue portion represents the portion of his payment that is going to interest. Here's pay-as-you-earn again. There's a lot of blue on this chart. which means that Billy actually negatively amortizes for a very long time. That's a function of his payment being lower under pay-as-you-earn than it would have been under IBR by about $100 a month. Billy negatively amortizes for 15 years out of 20 under pay-as-you-earn because his payment is just not enough to cover the amount of interest that's accruing. And that interest, again, it's not visualized here, but that interest continues to hang out there. And he has to pay it back before he can ever start paying down loan principal. And so he doesn't start doing that until year 16. And you can definitely infer from this chart that his loan is not repaid in full after the end of 20 years because the amount of his payment that's still going to interest is significant. And so what this means is that Billy is going to get loan forgiveness and may need to pay income tax on it again. The other thing that you should take away from this chart in particular, even though pay-as-you-earn, like IBR, has that secondary formula where payments convert from one based on income to one based on loan debt, because we're comparing 10% of discretionary income to the 10-year standard plan instead of 15%, as would be the case under IBR, it makes it that much less likely that Billy's payment is going to hit that secondary formula where you would see this chart begin to plateau, where his payment becomes capped at $711. Again, under pay-as-you-earn, his final payment, which is based on a significantly higher income, such as an increase at a rate of 5% a year, is only $605, and it would take more increases in income to get his payment to be $711, such that his payment becomes capped. And then we have revised pay-as-you-earn. First of all, remember, revised pay-as-you-earn can have a loan forgiveness period that's either 20 or 25 years, depending on the borrower. Billy borrowed for graduate school, so Billy is subject to a 25-year forgiveness period. The graph here sort of has the same shape as was the case for pay-as-you-earn, but there are a few different reasons why that is true. First of all, payments just happen to be rising gradually for Billy. But also remember, revised pay-as-you-earn doesn't have that secondary formula where payments become capped at the 10-year standard repayment amount. Billy's always paying 10% of his discretionary income year over year, regardless of how that compares to what he would have paid under the 10-year standard plan. So actually, starting in year 23, his payments at $720 are higher than they would have been under the 10-year standard plan. And then for year 24 and year 25, they're higher still as his income increases. Whether or not this is good or bad, I think, is in the eye of the beholder. Of course, the more you pay today, again, the less you pay in interest tomorrow. So not having this cap means that Billy is going to successfully repay more of his loan. He'll have less to be forgiven, but it also means that his tax bill may be smaller because he'll have paid more back on his loan before getting forgiveness. Billy does get forgiveness under the revised pay-as-you-earn plan. It's just in an amount that's significantly less than it was for pay-as-you-earn because he was in repayment for 5 more years and was repaying the same loan with the same characteristics at higher payment amounts for that time. So he pays down his loan more aggressively during that additional 5 years of repayment and revised pay-as-you-earn compared to pay-as-you-earn. The last thing that I want to talk about on this chart is that Billy's loans still negatively amortize, and they still negatively amortize for a pretty long period of time, for 12 years. But let's flip back to pay-as-you-earn for a minute. Billy's loans didn't stop negatively amortizing until year 16, but they stopped negatively amortizing 3 years earlier under revised pay-as-you-earn. And the reason why that's true is the interest subsidy. Interest subsidy, while providing this benefit to the borrower with respect to there just generally being less of an interest obligation, helps prevent the borrower from feeling some of the effects of negative amortization. So a borrower in revised pay-as-you-earn, because of the higher interest subsidy, and again, remember, revised pay-as-you-earn is also subsidizing unsubsidized loans, which make up the vast majority of Billy's debt, makes it him able to start chipping away at principal on his loans 3 years sooner than would have been the case under pay-as-you-earn. For those of you who want to have your own Billy borrower adventure, or maybe have students who do, you should use the repayment estimator on studentloans.gov. We actually have a short link to it. I think there's it's typed at the end of the slide deck, but it's studentaid.gov/repayment-estimator. There are two flavors to the repayment estimator. If you happen to have an FSA ID, you are free to, and we recommend that you do log in with your FSA ID, where it will pull in all of your loan information from the National Student Loan Data System, ask you a few more pieces of information about things like your income and your family size and whether or not you're married, and we'll talk about why that's relevant in a while, and spit out estimates, or you can proceed to the tool without logging in which case you need to manually enter loans, which can be helpful for you if you're trying to prepare sort of generalized debt profiles for your students. You can and should use this tool in order to do that, if it's helpful. So we've talked about what the rules are to get in, we've talked about what the rules are for getting loan forgiveness, and we've talked about what the rules are for how we set your payment amount and some other stuff. But now that you have some information about what this thing actually is, we need to talk about how you get it. Unlike other repayment plans where you can basically just log onto a loan servicer's website and say like, hey, I want the extended plan, we don't know what we don't know. Income-driven repayment plans calculating payments based on income and family size, and us not having ready access to that information means that we need borrowers to provide it to us if we're going to figure out what their payments are. And so the application process is designed to solicit that information and other pieces of information that will help us process the borrower's application and get them set up on the right plan. Step one is you need to tell us what you're doing here. There are, believe it or not, a few different reasons why you might submit the application. In fact, we have identified 4 of them. I'm not in an IDR plan today and I want to get in one. I'm recertifying my income. This is something that borrowers need to do year over year if they want to stay making payments based on their income. You can do what we call recertify early. Again, the intent behind these plans is that payments should be manageable and affordable to you, but to the extent that that is not true for you because you've, say, experienced a drop in earnings or you've lost your job, you can come back in early and basically demonstrate to us that your circumstances have changed, you are worse off and need a lower payment, and get that payment right away instead of waiting until the end of your 12-month period to recertify. Or we have a 4th category, which is I'm in an income-driven repayment plan today and I want to be in one tomorrow, but I want to be in a different one. So basically I want to change between income-driven plans. Obviously, if you are applying to get into an income-driven repayment plan or switching between them, you need to tell us what plan you want. As of a few years ago, we embed a default option into the income-driven repayment application that I'm paraphrasing here because we would never actually say this in a form, but this is all way too complicated for me to figure out. I don't know which one of these things I want. I know I want whichever one gives me the lowest payment. So loan servicer, here's all the stuff you need. You figure it out and let me know which plan you put me in and what my payment is when you're done. Borrowers don't have to do that. This is a default option. They're free to customize their request however they want. They can select one plan. They can request to be considered for 2 plans and nothing more, and that's fine. Again, we haven't talked about spouses yet, but we solicit information about a borrower's spouse on the IDR application because that information can be highly relevant to calculating their payment amount. We'll certify family size. This is a term that is different from the number of exemptions, but they are generally consistent. So your spouse, your kids, other people who live with you and who you support, that kind of thing. And then you need to determine what kind of income documentation you're going to submit to us. There are two different types, adjusted gross income and alternative documentation of income. And we'll talk a little bit in a few minutes about the distinction between the two and when you submit one versus the other. But after you determine what type you submit, you actually need to make good on that decision and submit it to us. So speaking of spouses, there are only some plans and some circumstances in which a spouse's information is relevant to a borrower's payment amount. However, in lieu of having the borrower figure out exactly what circumstance they're in and when it's relevant and when it's not, which can get pretty complicated, and to support a default option that allows a loan servicer to just figure out whatever plan gives the lowest payment, we request and require that almost all borrowers, with some limited exceptions, submit information about their spouse, including identifiers and income documentation as necessary. But it's not always relevant. And so loan servicers, knowing the rules of these plans, will disregard any information that they receive that's irrelevant to the plan that the borrower is ultimately in. speaking of those exceptions, there are two of them. If a borrower is separated from his or her spouse, and we don't define what that is on purpose, and when the borrower is unable to obtain the spouse's, reasonably obtain the spouse's income documentation, which is also intentionally undefined. So if either of those two exceptions are met by the borrower self-certification, they are able to proceed without providing income documentation of their spouse. That's how we ask people to document it. Here is when the spouse's income is relevant. As you'll notice, we have one column that's about repayment plan and two that's about filing status. And those are really the only two criteria that you need to figure out whether or not income documentation of a spouse is relevant to the borrower. If a borrower files a joint tax return with his or her spouse, that combined adjusted gross income or that combined income is used to calculate the borrower's payment on all of the income-driven repayment plans. If a borrower files separately from his or her spouse, then only the borrower's income is used to calculate the borrower's payment on ICR, IBR, and pay-as-you-earn, three of the income-driven repayment plans. But for revised pay-as-you-earn, we add the two incomes together to calculate the borrower's income-driven repayment amount. But it's not just income that's relevant. Loan debt is also relevant. And to demonstrate how loan debt is also relevant in the context of spouses and income-driven repayment, we had Billy get hitched in year 5. So Billy gets married, and his spouse has $20,000 of income and $40,000 of direct loans, all unsubsidized, all of its 5.5% interest rate. Billy and his spouse decide to file separately. So let's see what happens. And I'm only comparing pay-as-you-earn and revised pay-as-you-earn because the only difference between the two in this example is the effect of the marriage and the decision to file jointly or separately. So it will help demonstrate the concept, but the other repayment plans follow the same rules as pay-as-you-earn does. So for pay-as-you-earn, Billy's payment amount actually decreases from $256, which is what it would have been had he not gotten married, to $197 in year 6. The spouse's income and loan debt is not included in the calculation at all. And the reason why there's this increase in payment, or decrease in payment rather, is because there's been an increase in family size. The way we calculate discretionary income is such that as your family size increases, the amount of income that we determine is discretionary to you decreases. We do that using the poverty guidelines published by the Department of Health and Human Services. For revised pay-as-you-earn, the payment amount decreases, but you'll notice that it decreases less significantly than it did for pay-as-you-earn. The spouse's income is included in the calculation of Billy's payment, and the reason why that's true is that revised pay-as-you-earn doesn't care how you file. If you're married, then a joint income is used regardless of filing status. But the spouse's loan debt is also included in the calculation, and that calculation generally, when the spouse has loan debt and we are using the spouse's income, is we will add the incomes together and figure out, or rather we'll add the loan debts together and figure out who owes each share of what, of the combined total. So if each spouse had $40,000 of debt, there's a 50-50 split, and whatever amount we calculate based on that 50-50 split, or rather the payment amount that's 10% of discretionary income will be prorated by the amount that Billy owes relative to the combined whole. And so the spouse's loan debt in this case means that Billy's payment is prorated by 62%, which is another way of saying he has 62% of the combined debt, which causes his payment to be higher than it would have otherwise been had the spouse's loan debt and income not been included, just because the spouse's income and loan debt to income ratios are swapped. One spouse has a higher loan debt relative to income than the other. And so there's sort of a cross-subsidization between the couple that happens when this type of thing occurs. But Billy's payment still also went down, at least in part, because his family size increased from 1 to 2. Now let's look at what happens if the spouse pays off his or her loans in year 6. So let's say the spouse wins the lottery and decides to not share the proceeds with Billy. I'm sure they'll work that out in counseling. Under pay-as-you-earn, it doesn't matter. because the spouse's income and loan debt wasn't relevant in the first place because they file separately. So his payment for year 7 is still the same $213 it would have otherwise been regardless of his spouse's income and loan debt. And the family size is still 2. But for revised pay-as-you-earn, the payment actually jumps somewhat considerably from $226 to $388. And the reason why that's true is because we're still combining the spouse's and the borrower's incomes together to calculate Billy's payment, but now Billy owes 100% of the outstanding debt. And so in effect, there's nothing to prorate against, or it's prorated against the percentage of 100%. And so Billy's payment ultimately increases by 72% between year 6 and year 7, even though the income only increased by 5%. And that is entirely attributable to the fact that the spouse's loan debt is no longer considered, even though the spouse's income will always be considered. And again, whether or not you think this is good or bad, or fair or not, is in the eye of the beholder, but it is certainly the way that the plans work, and some borrowers don't care, some borrowers hate it quite a lot. But it's the way this plan works in particular. There are a few more special rules for revised pay-as-you-earn. The 2 exceptions that I mentioned with respect to spouses and income documentation, either being separated or unable to reasonably access the spouse's income information, causes the spouse's income to be excluded from the calculation, again, regardless of filing status. So if Billy and a spouse were separated, only Billy's income would be included and only Billy's loan debt would be included in the calculations. For the other plans, that doesn't ultimately affect the family size, though. For the other plans, family size always includes your spouse, regardless of whether or not you're separated and regardless of whether or not you can access your spouse's income information. But revised pay-as-you-earn basically says, if you're excluding your spouse's income from the calculation of your revised pay-as-you-earn payment amount, you also must exclude your spouse from family size. And it's a matter of our loan servicers actually being sure that the spouse is excluded from family size, regardless of what the borrower writes in on his or her application. But it is sort of a nuance here. We're going to wrap up this part of the presentation by talking about the types of income documentation that a borrower can submit and when they go about doing that. You all know and love the term adjusted gross income, or AGI, who deal with it all day, every day for the FAFSA. A borrower will use adjusted gross income to document his or her income for income-driven payment amounts when the borrower has filed taxes in the last 2 years, and the borrower tells us that there has not been a significant change, i.e. a drop in his or her income since he or she filed his or her last tax return. If they filed taxes, but there has been a significant change, again, i.e. drop in income since the last filing, the borrower is pushed into an alternative documentation of income situation where the borrower will generally be providing us with documentation such as pay stubs to figure out what the borrower's payment amount is. Alternative documentation of income will also be used for those for whatever reason the borrower has not filed taxes at all within the last 2 years. So you know when we'll use which type of income documentation. This slide talks about how we go about documenting each type of income documentation. Adjusted gross income, you can document to us electronically using an electronic application that we have online at studentloans.gov. It uses the same IRS data retrieval tool that you all know and love from the FAFSA to allow a borrower to import his or her spouse's adjusted gross income into the application and have that electronically transmitted to the borrower's loan servicer. A borrower can submit a signed or unsigned copy of the borrower's latest tax return, or if for whatever reason they have a tax transcript lying around, they're free to submit that as well. Alternative documentation of income is generally, like I mentioned, something like pay stubs, but technically it's all taxable income that the borrower receives. So that could include things like unemployment benefits or other types of income that a borrower may receive. And it's not just earned income, it's all ordinary income. So dividends even are technically required to be considered. We generally allow people to self-certify if they have no income because it's pretty difficult to prove a negative. And borrowers are free to proceed along a fully electronic path for their income-driven repayment application if they are self-certifying that they have no income. So you can submit an electronic application online if you're either using the IRS data retrieval tool or you're saying that you need to submit alternative documentation of income and you have no income. If you don't want to use the IRS data retrieval tool, or you tell us that you need to provide us with alternative documentation of income like a pay stub, there's still an electronic file that's submitted and it's sent to the servicer and they can begin to process that. But they're still waiting on paper copies of the income documentation necessary to ultimately get the borrower set up onto income-driven repayment. The borrower is also given a pre-populated PDF of an IDR application that they can download, print, sign, and send in along with their income documentation so that the loan servicer basically knows why the borrower is submitting it. I've talked a little bit about recertification and some of the consequences of failing to recertify. I want to talk about those in more detail because they can be somewhat severe and actually kind of scary to borrowers if they experience them. In almost all cases, we're talking about interest capitalization, sometimes in large amounts, which generally borrowers really dislike, and a significant increase in the borrower's payment amount, which, if you're in an income-driven repayment plan, sort of defeats the purpose of having entered it in the first place. For income-contingent repayment, you stay in ICR, but your payment is no longer based on income and is instead the 10-year standard repayment amount. For IBR, interest capitalizes, you stay in the plan, and just like ICR, your payment amount becomes the 10-year standard repayment amount. For pay-as-you-earn, interest capitalizes, and I mean, I can read this to you, but it's the same as IBR. And for revised pay-as-you-earn, the effect is largely the same, but it's handled in a somewhat different way. First of all, interest does capitalize, but instead of staying in the plan, you're actually kicked out of revised pay-as-you-earn entirely. And you're placed in an alternative repayment plan. And your repayment amount is calculated in an amount that is a standard repayment amount, so fixed payments, over a period of time that's the lesser of 10 years, or however long you otherwise had left to get forgiveness. Basically, this was implemented as a way to be sure that we weren't encouraging people to not recertify so that their payment would go down and they would get loan forgiveness in the end. So let's see how that works out for Billy. You'll remember he got married in year 5, so maybe year 4 he was planning his wedding and things got hectic. For ICR, again, he stayed in his plan, but his payment jumps to $711 from $545, so that's a big jump, especially if you're planning for a wedding. In IBR, $2,017 of interest capitalizes, he stays in the plan, and his payment increases even more. Still to $711, but from a smaller starting point of $337. For pay-as-you-earn, more interest capitalizes, and again, the reason why that's true is because Billy's payment started out lower and is still lower. So there's more outstanding interest because more negative amortization occurred. His payment increases from $224 to $711. You're sensing a theme in the $711 figure. That's the 10-year standard repayment amount. And for revised pay-as-you-earn, around $1,200 of interest capitalizes, which is actually less than pay-as-you-earn, but he's kicked out of the plan, and his payment is $724 instead of $711. This is just attributable to the slightly different way that borrowers are penalized / incentivized, depending on how you look at it, to recertify their income every year. If you're curious about why revised pay-as-you-earn has less outstanding interest capitalizing than pay-as-you-earn, even though the payment amounts are the same, this is the interest subsidy at work again. Because the interest has been written off or didn't accrue, however you want to think about it, there's less outstanding to capitalize when Billy does fail to recertify. Of course, before I get into some data, I want to go out of my way to say that borrowers who do fail to recertify, even though there are consequences to doing so, they can and are encouraged and are contacted to urge them to recertify. You can recertify late, get back into your income-driven repayment plan, or have your income-driven amount recalculated with no further penalty and without much delay. So a lot of the times, and again, this is mostly anecdotal, we find that borrowers just like miss the deadline or don't open the letter that we send them reminding them to recertify. They realize too late, and it's a matter of recertifying late and having dealt with the consequence of having interest capitalized and a payment go up instead of having things work smoothly. But now it's time for some data. We started analyzing the number of borrowers who entered an IDR plan from a non-IDR plan by year and by plan. And so basically what you can see, and this trend is somewhat obscured because we have disaggregated things by plan, and we've introduced new plans as time has worn on. The total amount of borrowers entering IDR year over year has increased. It just so happens that the plan that they are choosing to enter is changing based on the availability of plans and the eligibility criteria. It in no way surprises me that revised pay-as-you-earn had over 1 million borrowers enter it in 2017. Again, all of this data is calendar year based, as opposed to ICR, which generally has higher payments and generally is less advantageous. So there's a lot of common sense sort of trends that we're seeing here, but on the whole, borrowers are entering income-driven repayment in higher numbers, which harkens back to the earlier slide of about 20% of borrowers repaying an IDR in 2013 versus over half today. Here's the average decrease in the borrower's monthly payment amount when they enter an IDR plan from a non-IDR plan. And so this is again disaggregated by year and by plan. And so let's just look at 2017 for some interesting facts. First of all, IBR and pay-as-you-earn produced pretty similar reductions in monthly payments of somewhere between $380 and almost $400 a month, which actually is pretty considerable. I wouldn't mind $400 extra in my paycheck every month. But one of the other trends that I think bears noticing is that the reductions in payment amount have actually increased over time. And the reason why I think that is true is borne out by the next slide, which is the average debt of borrowers entering an IDR plan from a non-IDR plan, again by year and by plan. We've seen average debt levels sort of increase over the course of the last few years, bearing in mind that the difference between a non-IDR plan and an IDR plan is that a non-IDR plan calculates your payment based on your loan balance. And so you're starting from a higher point, looking back at this last slide, from which you could achieve a reduction in your payment. There could also be economic factors here related to incomes rising or falling that are affecting this as well. But there's definitely a relationship between the savings that accrue to a borrower who enters IDR and the level of their debt. Income-driven repayment is a tool that helps you manage your loan debt, and therefore it stands to reason that the more debt you have, the more of a month-over-month gain you may see from income-driven repayment relative to a borrower with the same income who has less loan debt, because there's less of a payment amount reduction that you get if you have a lower loan debt relative to a borrower with a higher loan debt. What you can see here is that over the course of the last 4 years, borrowers tend to enter income-driven repayment less than a year after they enter repayment, which personally I think is pretty good. It means that borrowers who need income-driven repayment, by and large, are getting access to it or getting into it pretty quickly after they enter repayment, at least relative to the 20 or 25 years that they may spend in that plan after they get there. And then because we talked a lot about spouses and how borrowers filed their taxes and what impact that does or doesn't have on a borrower's monthly payment amount, here's some data on the percentage of borrowers in each plan who have various tax filing statuses. And so about half of our borrowers are single. We have a large tranche of borrowers for whom the tax filing status is unknown, which could absolutely be the case just for someone who is not doing like the IRS data retrieval tool or is not submitting their tax return as documentation of their income. But just like you would expect, the percentage of borrowers who are married and filing jointly versus separately is very different. Most borrowers file jointly, most citizens file jointly, because generally there are greater tax advantages to doing so. Not always, but most of the time. And for most couples, it's simply just easier to manage their finances if they file a joint return versus a separate return. And so it's important when people are thinking about how to file their taxes with respect to income-driven repayment, It's true that filing separately for some plans may result in a lower income-driven repayment amount, but you also have to bear in mind that as a household, you're probably dealing with a broader financial picture than just what's happening with your student loans. Filing separately may save you more in student loan payments, but may increase your taxes so much that it completely wipes out the reduction in student loan payments. Again, this is all hypothetical. It really depends on the couple and their finances and their individual circumstances, but there's more to the piece of the student loan repayment puzzle than just what happens to your student loan payment in the context of income-driven repayment. And with that, I am now ready to open it up for questions. So please, we have microphones now, so please come up to the mics and fire away.
I'll let you finish drinking.
Thanks.
So as far as the subsidy goes for the interest, is it reflected in their monthly statements from their servicer? Or like, how are they supposed to keep track?
I don't think we expect borrowers to keep track of the amount of subsidy that they're receiving. It's something that's provided automatically. They don't need to do anything in order to get it. It just happens automatically. I think our loan servicers right now have different methods of sort of tracking the interest subsidy and communicating it to borrowers. I don't know that all of them even do communicate it to borrowers. I envision a next-gen world in which certainly those inconsistencies are eliminated, and maybe we start to communicate a little bit more about the subsidy that borrowers receive and do so in a more clear manner. But right now, there's not really a clear answer that I can give to you.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
First, I really want to thank you for all this information. It really helps me to be able to help student borrowers and especially graduates who come back that are totally confused and get into the wrong payment plans. So really, thank you for that. One of the main questions I get from potential grads, and I don't mean to bring back the public service loan forgiveness, but it all kind of ties in.
It does.
So they're making a decision at this point, am I going into public service or am I not? What are the consequences of me going into an income-based repayment plan if I then have all negative amortization and go into a private, let's say they're a lawyer and go into private practice? I don't really want that consequence. And then the other question I get is, I'm going into public service for sure, going to work for the Department of Education, but then I eventually want your job, and so I'm going to make the big bucks at some point, but I want to have the 10-year loan forgiveness. I want to do public service, but my income, I want to get to the point where I'm in. So those are the two options that I really don't get all the, innuendos here to be able to say, do this, do that. And I hate to say them, go to the website and start doing your calculations. I'd rather have a more informed decision for them. And do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, I guess the primary suggestion that I would have, and the same sentiments that are reflected in your question are sentiments that I hear from borrowers when they somehow find my phone number and call me. But there's sort of a fundamental tension between what borrowers want and what they're able to get. You can't really have this both ways. You can't get into an IDR plan and then not realize the effects of negative amortization if you're going to not pursue public service loan forgiveness. It's just the fact. If you don't want to feel the effects of negative amortization, you need to repay under a repayment plan that doesn't provide for negative amortization. The standard plan, extended plan, graduated, et cetera. Similarly, for those who want to get PSLF but also want to earn the big bucks, it's hard to do, right? Because you need to make 10 years of qualifying payments at a government or a nonprofit. And, whatever you want to think about federal, state, or salaries of those who work at at charities, you can still probably make big bucks working in some of those places, but then your IDR payment is going to be higher and you're going to realize less of a benefit from PSLF, if any benefit from PSLF. And so when I hear questions like this from borrowers, I usually don't phrase it in quite this way because it would be a little, glib, but you can't have your cake and eat it too. So you really do sort of need to figure out, am I gunning for public service loan forgiveness? Is this really a good program for me to pursue? Do I want to pursue income-driven repayment alone without public service loan forgiveness? And there's not really a right or wrong answer here. There's no right way to repay your student loans except to not default on them. And so what someone wants to prioritize over something else is at least one that is generally personal. And so generally what I try to do when I'm talking to borrowers is get a sense of what their priorities actually are, and then steer them towards an option that maximizes what they prioritize without accruing too many things that they want to avoid in the consequences column. But basically saying like, I want a $0 payment in IDR and no interest, negative amortization, like you just can't have that. Go ahead, Tony.
Yeah, I think it's important. I think it's important in that scenario, in those cases, that you try to say to someone, okay, you're going to work 10 years in a not-for-profit. You may lose 20, 30, 40,000 a year of income. Oh, that's $400,000. I'm just making up numbers. How important will that be for you? What if you're single? What if there are other people in your life? I think you got to try to give them something to think about with some kind of numbers, and it makes them think. Well, maybe it doesn't matter to me right now, but it might matter to me later on. That's 30, 40,000 multiplied by whatever that comes to per week, per month of a paycheck. When you have a mortgage and you have a child to feed, it might make a difference.
No, you're absolutely right. I know that I'm usually not shy about telling people I'm in revised pay-as-you-earn. I'm trying to get PSLF. It's probably one of the reasons they sent me to talk about it. I've definitely crunched the numbers about, if I ever left the government, not that I'm planning to, but like if I ever left the government, like how much would a private employer need to pay me to make foregoing PSLF worth it? And every year that I work for the government, that number gets higher and higher. Just because, I'm like 8 years in to PSLF now, so like it's like that number is getting significantly higher because I went to law school, so that's expensive. But yeah, like when I talk to borrowers, it's exactly that type of conversation as well. I generally, like you, try to throw out really round numbers just to sort of get them thinking about concepts, but absolutely.
Honestly, I tell my borrowers that it's a government program and to not put all their eggs in that basket, but that's like neither here nor there. If I have a borrower that is like in an income-driven plan, but they want to pay more, maybe to like have less capitalization or, put money towards their payment or towards their principal when they can, how is the best way to do that, like with their servicer? Yeah,
so there are different ways right now for borrowers to allocate payments towards individual loans or specify that they don't want this payment to like reduce what they have to pay in the future, et cetera. But it bears repeating, and I know that we all use shorthand when we talk about like applying a payment to principal because we're thinking about it probably from like a mortgage context. But especially for income-driven repayment where loans can and often do negatively amortize, when a borrower says, I want this payment to go to principal, it's like, well, that's nice, but you don't really have that control. Like you can't pay down any principal until all of your interest is satisfied. Mm-hmm. So if it so happens that like your payment's $100 a month and after you pay that $100, there's no outstanding interest left, then the remainder that you pay towards that loan will automatically go to principal. You don't need to say anything. The only thing that you may want to say, and this is probably more critical for public service loan forgiveness, interested borrowers than anybody else, is, okay, I'm paying that extra $100. Do I want that to reduce what I have to pay next month, or do I still want to be legally obligated to pay the full payment next month? That matters for public service loan forgiveness, but for income-driven repayment, it doesn't so much. And so usually where this conversation is more helpful is for somebody whose loans are positively amortizing. So there is like an actual principal reduction that's happening every month. And borrowers want to target all of their excess payments towards like a loan with a higher interest rate or the loan with the lowest balance or some other type of prepayment debt reduction strategy. And right now, all of the servicers have ways to target payments at different loans. And they have different ways in which you can provide instructions to say, hey, don't pay me ahead. I want to pay my regular payment next month, regardless of this extra that I'm giving you now. But they all have a way to do it. It's just different right now. Again, I've said this a few times today, next gen.
Thank you.
We're out of questions already? I don't mind resting my voice, so we can just wrap it up. Thanks, guys.